They handed me the severance letter under the glare of fluorescent lights, the same lights that flickered when I first wired the server room 20 years ago. I'm Walter Keaton, 58, former lead systems engineer. My old Veltria ID card still dangled from my pocket as I walked out. Funny how the last thing they gave me was permission to leave. Ever had someone fire you, then beg for your help? You know we can get 3 junior engineers for your salary, right? Grant Monroe smirked as he slid the termination letter across the table. His fingers tapped lightly on the mahogany surface, a rhythm that seemed almost rehearsed. I glanced down at the folder, thick, neat, and embossed with the Veltria Housing logo. 18 years of work reduced to 30 pages and a polite handshake. Diane Harper, the HR manager, sat beside him, hands folded neatly on her lap, expressionless as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. Her eyes never met mine. It was all part of the script. "This is part of our restructuring initiative," she began, voice as smooth as the silk scarf knotted around her neck. "Nothing personal, Walter. Strictly financial." I picked up the folder, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should be. "Nothing personal?" I echoed, my voice even. Grant's smile widened, his teeth impossibly white under the fluorescent lights. "You understand, don't you? Just business?" he added, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled like a man who had already won. I nodded, slipping the folder into my briefcase. "I understand," I replied, standing up slowly. My knees cracked, a subtle reminder of the years I had spent hunched over server racks and debugging lines of code. Monroe's grin faltered for a split second, as if he expected me to rage or threaten, maybe even beg. But I didn't. I simply straightened my back, buttoned my jacket, and reached out my hand. He hesitated but took it. His grip was firm but hollow, like shaking hands with a mannequin. "Best of luck, Walter," he said. His eyes flickered to Diane, who immediately pushed a pen and a final document across the table. Severance agreement, 2 months of salary, full benefits through the end of the quarter. I signed without reading it. "That'll be all," Diane murmured. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she were afraid the walls would remember her complicity. I walked back to my office, the echo of my footsteps the only sound in the hallway. My desk was exactly as I had left it that morning. Neat stacks of paperwork, a half-empty coffee cup, and my old Veltria ID card, still clipped to its retractable holder. I paused, picking it up. It was scratched, the corners slightly bent from years of swiping through electronic locks. I unclipped it and placed it gently on the center of my desk, smoothing it down with my fingertips. There was a thin layer of dust on the server room lights, a testament to the neglect that had settled in after the private equity firm took over. Veltria had been different once. Harold Bay, the original owner, used to walk the floors with his sleeves rolled up, shaking hands with engineers, asking real questions, listening to our ideas. That was before the quarterly reports mattered more than the tenants, before the consultants started flooding in with their spreadsheets and MBA jargon. A cardboard box sat beneath my desk. I opened it and began loading my belongings, a few framed photographs, some books, a ceramic mug from our first system launch. It all fit neatly inside. 20 years of building and maintaining Veltria's entire IT infrastructure, condensed to a dozen items. The elevator dinged as I stepped inside, the doors sliding shut with a smooth, sterile silence. I pressed the button for the lobby and watched as the floor numbers ticked down. When the doors opened, Martin Page was waiting, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "They really did it," he finally said, his voice low. There was no surprise in his tone, just resignation. Martin had been with me since the beginning. He knew what it meant to build something piece by piece, server by server. Cost-cutting, I replied simply. Martin shook his head, reaching into his coat pocket. It's not just the salaries, he whispered, pressing a USB drive into my hand. They've been moving funds out of the pension accounts, quietly, bit by bit. I stared at the USB, feeling its weight settle in my palm. You're sure? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Martin nodded, his gaze steely. They've got the books cooked up so neatly you'd never catch it, unless you knew where to look. He paused, glancing around before leaning in closer. Plug that in when you get home. You'll want to see it. I slipped the drive into my pocket, gripping it tightly. Thanks, Martin, I said, and he clasped my shoulder, eyes sincere. They'll call you back, he added, his voice steady. When the whole thing falls apart, they'll call you. I stepped through the lobby, sunlight streaming through the glass doors, casting long shadows on the polished marble floor. As I pushed open the door and felt the cool Denver air hit my face, I took a deep breath. My car sat waiting in the lot, dusted lightly with the season's first frost. I opened the trunk and placed the cardboard box inside with a soft thud. I stood there for a moment, hands resting on the edge of the trunk, looking back at the building. Veltria. 18 years of my life etched into its walls, its wires, its servers. And then, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else, they'll call me back. The drive home was quiet. I pulled into my driveway, parked, and sat there for a while, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Martin. Plug in that USB, you're going to want to see this. I stared at the message for a long time, fingers brushing over the surface of the USB in my coat pocket. It felt heavier now, like it carried more than just data. It carried answers. Tomorrow I would plug it in. I watched the sun dip below the mountains, casting long shadows over Lake Dillon. Bourbon never tasted this bitter. The glass was heavy in my hand, half empty but lingering with the sharpness of years gone by. From the edge of the porch, the lake stretched out like glass, untouched and eternal. I came here to clear my head, but the silence only made the echoes louder. Ellen stepped out onto the deck, her footsteps soft against the old wooden planks. She wrapped a knitted shawl tighter around her shoulders, glancing out over the water. "You've been out here a while," she said gently. Her voice was a comfort I had come to rely on, even when everything else had been stripped away. I sipped from the glass, the liquid burning down my throat. "Just thinking," I replied, eyes never leaving the horizon. She walked over, resting her hands on the railing beside me. "About Veltria?" she asked. I nodded. 18 years, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Built it from scratch, watched it grow. Now it's someone else's problem. Ellen placed a hand on mine. "You did your part," she said firmly. "What they did to you, that's on them." I nodded, but the ache didn't go away. "Harold would have never let this happen," I muttered. Her eyes softened. "I know," she replied, "but Harold isn't there anymore." I stared out at the lake, recalling Harold Bay's voice echoing in my mind. "Build it strong, Walter. They might forget how it works, but it'll never fail." He always believed in foundations, solid, unyielding. Veltria was built that way once. Now it was hollowed out by spreadsheets and profit margins. The next morning, I busied myself with fixing things around the cabin. It was an old place, full of memories and rusted hinges. The kind of place that had to be maintained, nurtured, just like Veltria used to be. I replaced a loose floorboard, patched up a broken screen door, anything to keep my hands moving. The silence of the lake was both calming and deafening. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Samantha stepping out of her car, dressed in sharp gray slacks and a blouse, carrying a leather-bound folder under her arm. I wiped my hands on a rag and met her halfway. "You didn't call," I said. She shrugged, giving me that familiar smile of determination. "I didn't want you to say no," she replied, her eyes sparkling with the same fire I saw when she graduated law school. We settled on the porch, and she handed me the folder. "You're not going to like this," she started. I raised an eyebrow, flipping it open. Inside were financial statements, pension payouts, quarterly summaries. The numbers were marked in red ink, annotated with small handwritten notes. "What am I looking at?" I asked, glancing up. Samantha leaned back, crossing her legs. "Pension payouts have been decreasing," she began. "Not just by a little, quarter by quarter, almost unnoticeable unless you track it over time." I looked back at the papers. She was right. The adjustments were slight, just enough to stay under the radar. "It started right after the acquisition," she continued. "Whoever's managing the books is good. They're siphoning just enough to stay invisible." I set the folder down, staring out at the lake. "Why are you bringing this to me?" I asked, my voice heavy. Samantha leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "Because you built it," she said, "and you know where the cracks are." We sat for a long while, sipping coffee and watching the mist roll off the water. The steam curled upward, dissipating into the crisp mountain air. I turned the pages slowly, letting the numbers sink in. Each line item felt like another nail in Veltria's coffin. "They're hiding it," I murmured. Samantha nodded. "And they used your exit as the perfect excuse," she replied. "No one left who actually knows how it all fits together." Her words hung in the air like fog. I stared at the papers again, feeling the weight of 18 years settling back onto my shoulders. "What do you want me to do?" I asked finally. Samantha's eyes sparkled with that familiar fire. "Look into it. Just see what's there," she said softly. "If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if I'm right..." I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs with air but leaves you feeling emptier than before. "All right," I agreed. Her smile was small but genuine. "I knew you would," she said, patting my hand. That evening, after she left, I sat alone at my desk, the cabin silent save for the creaking of old wood and the whisper of wind outside. The USB Martin had given me lay on the edge of my desk, untouched. I reached for it, fingers brushing its smooth plastic surface. I stared at the computer, its screen dark, waiting. I plugged it in. The screen flickered to life, and a small notification appeared. "USB detected? Would you like to open the drive?" I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the mouse. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches against the window pane. I took a deep breath, clicked "Yes," and watched the files unfold before me. "It's all falling apart," Martin's voice crackled over the phone. "Veltria is bleeding, and they don't even know it." His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the static. I leaned back in my chair, the USB drive still warm in my hand. Outside the cabin, snow was beginning to settle on the lake's surface, a thin film of frost crystallizing with each passing moment. "How bad is it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Martin sighed, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of too many years under fluorescent lights and midnight server restarts. "Patching on top of patches," he replied. "They're running the system like it's held together with duct tape and good intentions. Monroe's been authorizing temporary fixes for months now. It's all about appearance, not function." I rubbed my temples, feeling the dull ache of frustration settle behind my eyes. And the pensions? I pressed. Martin hesitated, and that pause was enough. We need to talk, he finally said. In person. Martin's apartment was as cluttered as I remembered it. Stacks of old manuals, server logs, and printouts of financial reports that had been crammed into every available surface. A thin layer of dust coated everything, as if even the air had grown tired of moving. He greeted me at the door with a nod, ushering me inside without a word. On the dining table, half buried under piles of Ethernet cables and unopened envelopes, sat his laptop, an old Lenovo model, its screen flickering slightly under the strain of too many applications running at once. "You're still using that relic?" I asked, smirking. Martin chuckled, patting the machine affectionately. "I like things that are built to last," he replied, eyes twinkling. He cleared a stack of paperwork from a chair, motioning for me to sit. "All right," he began, cracking his knuckles before sliding the laptop towards me. "Let's see what Monroe's been hiding." I plugged the USB drive in, and the screen flickered to life, lines of code scrolling rapidly before resolving into a series of encrypted files. Martin clicked through a few layers of folders until he found what he was looking for. "Here," he said, tapping the screen. The first file opened to a spreadsheet titled Cost Recovery Initiatives, Q4 2018. My eyes scanned the lines. Budget reallocations, system downgrades, pension fund adjustments. "They've been diverting money out of maintenance budgets," Martin explained, scrolling further. "Instead of replacing faulty servers, they're just patching them over and over. It's a miracle the system's still running." I leaned in closer, my eyes narrowing at the columns marked pension adjustment. "And this?" I asked, tapping the screen. Martin pursed his lips. "That's where it gets interesting," he replied. "They've been cutting pension payouts incrementally every quarter, just small enough not to raise flags." I ran a hand through my hair, processing the information. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. Martin shrugged. "Since you left. Maybe before that. Monroe's got it all tied up in paperwork, hidden under operational adjustments and infrastructure efficiency. It's like they're squeezing blood from a stone." A knock at the door broke our concentration. Martin's eyes flickered nervously, and he got up to answer. A moment later he returned with a man in his early 40s, thick glasses perched on his nose, and a folder clutched tightly in his hands. "Walter, this is Hank Milton," Martin introduced. "Hank's been managing the data integrity reports for the past few years." Hank nodded, eyes darting around the cluttered apartment before settling on me. "I heard about what happened," he said, voice low. "Didn't think they'd actually go through with it." I shrugged. They did. Hank hesitated before placing the folder on the table. "I thought you should have this," he said, pushing it towards me. I opened it and found pages of encrypted emails, transaction records, and what looked like financial logs. "These are internal communications," Hank continued. "Monroe's been moving money around for months, adjusting numbers, masking deficits. It's all here." I flipped through the pages, scanning the numbers, the signatures, the hidden line items that had been so carefully buried. "How did you get this?" I asked, my voice steady. Hank smiled faintly. "I'm in charge of backups," he replied. "Nobody ever remembers to delete things from the backups." Martin let out a low whistle. "You realize if they find out you gave us this, you're done," he said. Hank nodded. "I know," he replied, "but somebody has to do something. Monroe's running Veltria into the ground, and nobody's even paying attention." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cluttered blinds, I held up a cracked and worn Veltria employee ID card I found tucked in a box of old memories Martin had stored. The plastic was scratched, the barcode nearly faded. My name, Walter Keaton, was still legible, but just barely. I turned it over in my hands, the weight of it familiar yet distant. It felt like holding a piece of something I had once been, something solid and meaningful. Martin looked up from the laptop. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. I nodded, slipping the ID card into my coat pocket. "It's going to break," I said quietly. "Veltria's systems, they're not going to last." Martin's fingers tapped nervously on the table. "And when it does?" he asked. I looked out the window at the Denver skyline, Veltria's tower standing tall but fragile against the fading light. "They'll call," I replied. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my cabin, the flicker of firelight casting shadows along the walls, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, eyes scanning the screen. It was an email from Grant Monroe. The subject line read, "Urgent system failure. Need immediate response." The body of the message was simple. "We need you back, Walter. Name your price." I stared at it for a long moment, fingers hovering over the screen. And then I powered the phone off. Grant Monroe stood on my doorstep, his designer glasses slightly askew. "We need your help," he whispered. His breath formed small puffs of mist in the frigid winter air, hanging momentarily before disappearing into the night. Snow had piled up around the edges of my driveway, untouched and pristine, as if even the world itself had paused to watch this moment unfold. I didn't invite him in. He stood there, shivering slightly, hands stuffed into the pockets of his designer coat, the kind that looked warm but probably wasn't. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice cracking just enough for me to hear it. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and nodded slowly. "Go ahead," I said. Grant cleared his throat, glancing back at the black sedan idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the falling snow. We have a situation," he started, his voice dropping to a hushed tone. "The system, it's failing. It started with tenant records going missing, maintenance requests getting duplicated. Now we've got whole sections of the database throwing errors. I don't know how much longer it's going to hold." I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Temporary patches not holding up?" I asked, my tone light, almost conversational. His jaw clenched. "We were making progress," he insisted, though even he didn't sound convinced. "But the architecture, you designed it. Only you understand how it all connects." I let the silence hang between us, the cold creeping into my bones but satisfying in its stillness. "So, what do you want me to do about it?" I asked finally. Grant shifted his weight, hands pulling tighter into his coat pockets. "Consult?" he replied, almost stumbling over the word. "We need you to come back and consult. Just for a few weeks. I've got authorization for double your old salary. You name the hours?" I almost laughed at the desperation in his eyes. "Double, huh?" I mused, tapping my chin thoughtfully. "That's generous." His eyes lit up, the glimmer of hope flickering back. "You'll do it?" he asked, voice rising slightly. I straightened up, the snow crunching under my boots as I stepped out onto the porch. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "No," I said simply. His expression froze, the optimism draining from his face. "Excuse me?" he stammered. I stepped back, crossing my arms again. "I'm not coming back, Grant. Not for double, not for triple. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it." His eyes narrowed, desperation quickly morphing into frustration. "You can't just walk away from this," he spat. "We have legal agreements, non-compete clauses. You could be held liable for damages if we can prove you intentionally." I laughed, the sound echoing off the snow-covered trees. "Do your worst," I replied. "File your lawsuits. I documented every request for maintenance, every warning I gave you, every damn email. If you want this to go public, Grant, be my guest." He stared at me, hands still buried in his pockets, fingers twitching slightly. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "We're not done," he said quietly. His breath fogged up his glasses, the condensation blurring his eyes. Not by a long shot. I watched him trudge back to his car, footprints marking the snow like a scar. His driver rushed to open the back door, and without another word, Monroe slipped inside. The car pulled away, its taillights glowing faintly as it disappeared into the night. I closed the door, locking it firmly behind me. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around me like a blanket, thawing out the chill Monroe had left behind. I moved to the fireplace, throwing another log onto the embers, watching the flames leap back to life. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I picked it up, the screen flashing with an unknown number. "Mr. Keaton," the voice began, smooth and clear. "Lawrence Devlin here. I believe we have a mutual interest in Veltria's current predicament." I leaned back in my chair, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "I believe we do," I replied. His chuckle was deep and confident. "I hear Monroe came knocking," he continued. "How desperate did he sound?" "On a scale of 1 to 10, I asked, pausing for effect. "About a 12. Lawrence laughed, the sound rich and unapologetic. "Well, we might be able to help him out," he said. "But only after we finish our little conversation. How about you drop by the office tomorrow? I've got something you might want to see." I agreed, the conversation wrapping up with a firmness that left no room for doubt. I hung up, staring into the fire as the logs crackled and popped. For the first time in a long while, I felt something that almost resembled excitement. The next morning I stepped into the gleaming lobby of Devlin Systems, greeted by polished marble floors and towering glass walls that stretched up towards the sky. A receptionist led me through a maze of hallways, each one brighter and more pristine than the last, until we reached a conference room encased entirely in glass. Lawrence Devlin stood at the far end, a folder tucked neatly under his arm. He turned when I entered, extending his hand. "Walter," he greeted warmly. His grip was firm, confident. "I've been looking forward to this." We sat across from each other, the Denver skyline stretching out behind him. He slid the folder across the table, nodding for me to open it. Inside were blueprints, server layouts, IT infrastructure plans that made Veltria look like a relic. "We want you to lead this," he said simply. "Chief Systems Architect, full benefits, stock options, and the budget to build it right." I looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no hesitation, no doubt. "I'm in," I replied. Lawrence smiled, reaching under the table to pull out a small rectangular box. He slid it towards me, the Devlin Systems insignia glimmering on the top. "Welcome to the future," he said. I opened it, and inside was a sleek, metallic ID card engraved with my name, Walter Keaton, Chief Systems Architect. Devlin Systems now owned everything I built, everything Grant Monroe tore apart. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked through the pristine hallways of Devlin's headquarters in Boulder, Colorado. The building gleamed with polished glass and brushed steel, a stark contrast to the aged corridors of Veltria. Here, everything was sharp, efficient, modern. Lawrence Devlin greeted me at the entrance, his hand extended, smile genuine. "Welcome to your new empire," he said, gesturing toward the panoramic view of the city skyline. I shook his hand firmly. "Let's get to work," I replied. He led me through a maze of glass-walled conference rooms, each buzzing with activity. Engineers hunched over sleek monitors, data streams lighting up the walls like neon veins. We reached the main conference room, where Martin Page was already waiting, flipping through a thick binder marked Migration Strategy, Phase 1. Lawrence slid a smaller binder across the table toward me. "Everything they broke," he began, his eyes catching mine with a glint of determination. "We'll rebuild stronger." I flipped it open, scanning the diagrams, server configurations, layered topologies. It was everything Veltria used to be, only better. Documented, optimized, reinforced. Martin leaned over, tapping the edge of the page. "This is your new playground," he smirked. I nodded, feeling that old fire reignite in my chest. By the end of the week, the first phase of the data migration had begun. Hank Milton, now officially part of Devlin's IT operations, oversaw the transfers. "We're pulling everything," he explained, his hands gliding over the keyboard. "Not just tenant records and maintenance logs. We're talking legacy backups, archived emails, even those old database logs they swore were deleted." The screens flickered with lines of code, data streams humming in synchronization as old servers blinked offline and new ones came to life. It was like watching history being rewritten, decay replaced with resilience, cracks sealed with precision. Martin joined me in the server room, clipboard in hand. "We've isolated most of the corrupted files," he reported. "Monroe's team left quite the mess, patches layered over patches, barely holding together." He handed me a stack of printouts. "And you might want to see this." I scanned the documents. Error logs, system overrides, time-stamped adjustments marked as infrastructure upgrades. But these weren't upgrades. They were diversions. Budget allocations marked for IT infrastructure that never happened. Instead, the funds were funneled into cost recovery initiatives. "That's what they called it," Martin explained. "Cost recovery? In reality, it was just them siphoning off pension funds, masking it as system maintenance." He tapped the screen, pulling up an encrypted folder titled Legacy Systems. Confidential. My eyes narrowed. "Have you opened it?" Martin shook his head. "It's heavily encrypted. We've been working on cracking it, but it's going to take time." I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink, almost taunting me. "We have time," I replied firmly, "and when it opens, we'll be ready." Hank joined us later in the afternoon, his expression tight. "You might want to come see this," he said, motioning us over to his workstation. Martin and I followed him down the hallway, past rows of humming servers. The air was cool, crisp with the sterile hum of machinery. Hank pulled up a console, lines of encrypted code scrolling by. "We were doing a routine migration," he explained, fingers dancing over the keys, "and we found this buried in one of the old Veltria server clusters." The screen shifted, revealing a file tree hidden 3 layers deep. "Legacy Systems, confidential," it read. I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Open it," I instructed. Hank nodded, tapping a few more keys before the folder unlocked with a soft beep. What came next was a cascade of financial records, pension adjustments, fund reallocations, invoices marked as infrastructure enhancements. But it was the timestamps that struck me. Every quarter, regular as clockwork, funds had been drained from the pension accounts, masked under system upgrades and legacy maintenance. Martin let out a low whistle. "This is it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "This is the smoking gun." Hank scrolled further, the record stretching back for years, each transaction buried under layers of bureaucracy and clever labeling. "He was bleeding them dry," Hank murmured, "and nobody saw it." I straightened up, a wave of clarity washing over me. "They saw it," I corrected. "They just didn't want to stop it." As the last file loaded onto the screen, Martin turned to me, his eyes sharper than I'd seen them in years. "If we reveal this," he said slowly, "Monroe is finished." I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink over the final entry. Legacy Maintenance, Q4 2019, $3,267,000 diverted. It was bold, reckless, arrogant. "Let it burn," I replied, voice steady. "Let the whole thing burn." Martin nodded, his gaze hardening. "I'll get the documentation ready," he said, patting my shoulder before heading back to his workstation. Hank lingered for a moment, watching the screen flicker with encrypted files still left to be unpacked. "Do you really think it'll be enough?" he asked. I met his gaze, feeling the weight of every decision I'd made since walking out of Veltria's lobby that cold morning. "Oh, it's enough," I assured him. "By the time we're done, there won't be enough left of Veltria for them to rebuild." Grant Monroe had nowhere left to hide, and I intended to watch him fall. The Denver courthouse stood tall and solemn, its marble pillars gleaming under the morning sun. Reporters clustered outside the entrance, their breath visible in the crisp air, microphones and cameras trained on the grand double doors. Samantha had told me to arrive early, but I couldn't help but linger in the car for a moment, watching the spectacle unfold. I stepped out, the chill biting against my cheeks as I buttoned my coat. Samantha was waiting on the steps, a thick folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her hair was pulled back sharply, eyes focused and unyielding. "You ready for this?" she asked, her breath puffing in the cold. I nodded. "I was ready the moment they signed my severance," I replied, climbing the steps alongside her. Inside, the courthouse was awash of polished stone and echoing footsteps. The ceilings stretched high, chandeliers hanging like frozen raindrops from their arches. We walked down the long corridor, past rows of solemn-faced attorneys and restless interns, until we reached the courtroom doors. The room was already filling up. Former Veltria employees sat huddled in small groups, their faces tight with anticipation. To one side, a cluster of reporters whispered among themselves, notepads ready, cameras perched on shoulders. In the front row, Martin Page caught my eye and gave me a slight nod. He had a grin that barely contained his satisfaction. Grant Monroe entered last, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers who looked more panicked than confident. He wore the same designer glasses, but his suit seemed to hang heavier on his frame, the lines of his face sharper under the courtroom lights. His eyes locked with mine for a split second before he turned away. Samantha took her place at the plaintiff's table, setting down her folder with a deliberate motion. She met my gaze, her expression unflinching. "You ready to do this?" she whispered. I nodded. "Let's bury him," I replied. The judge entered, the room rising in unison before settling back into tense silence. Proceedings began swiftly. Samantha wasted no time. She stood, heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the center of the room. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "Today, we intend to present evidence of systematic embezzlement of pension funds, masked under the guise of cost recovery initiatives. These actions were taken deliberately, with full awareness of their consequences." Her words echoed off the walls, sharp and unyielding. Monroe's lawyers stirred uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Samantha moved back to our table, picking up the folder and pulling out a stack of documents. "Exhibit A," she announced, handing it to the bailiff, who then passed it to the judge. "Financial logs detailing quarterly adjustments to pension payouts, masked as infrastructure improvements." I watched as the judge flipped through the pages, his eyebrows rising slightly with each turn. Samantha continued, her voice steady. "These adjustments were not random. They were orchestrated with precision, quarter by quarter, bleeding the pension fund to cover operational gaps while masking them as upgrades." Monroe's lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is circumstantial at best. These financial logs don't prove direct involvement." Samantha smiled, a flash of teeth that was both confident and ruthless. "I'm glad you mentioned that," she replied smoothly, "because Exhibit B is a series of encrypted emails recovered during the Veltria migration, emails signed directly by Mr. Monroe, authorizing these adjustments." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I watched Monroe's face drain of color, his eyes flickering nervously toward his legal team. Samantha stepped forward again, holding up the printed emails. "And I'd like to bring attention to this specific line," she said, tapping the paper, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Reallocate as necessary. Ensure discrepancies are marked as maintenance costs. GM." Monroe's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously. I sat back, crossing my arms and allowing myself a small smile. Martin caught my eye from the back of the room, nodding approvingly. The judge glanced up from the documents. "Mr. Monroe," he began, his voice firm, "do you have any response to these allegations?" Monroe stood, his hands shaking slightly. These documents are manipulated," he stammered. "There's no proof that I authorized any of this." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Would you like us to call in the forensic team that decrypted your emails? They're more than willing to testify." Monroe's lawyer grabbed his arm, pulling him back into his seat. The judge rapped his gavel. "Enough," he commanded. "We will hear the full testimony, and then I will decide." The hearing continued for another hour, Samantha laying out evidence with the precision of a surgeon. Financial logs, encrypted communications, even witness statements from former Veltria employees who had been told to not ask questions. It was a massacre, and Monroe knew it. When the judge finally banged his gavel and called for a recess, Monroe slumped back in his chair, sweat pooling at his temples. As the bailiffs approached him, his head shot up, eyes darting wildly. "It was sabotage," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "The systems, they were designed to fail. He did it." His finger jabbed toward me, his voice rising with every syllable. The room fell silent. I raised an eyebrow, slowly unfolding my arms. "Me?" I asked, almost amused. Monroe's face twisted with desperation. "You left it broken," he spat. "You left it just waiting to collapse." I stepped forward, my voice low and calm. "I just left it the way you built it," I replied, watching the words sink in. Monroe's eyes flared with rage, but there was nothing left for him to grab onto. Two bailiffs approached, handcuffs clicking softly as they secured his wrists. I watched as they led him away, his footsteps heavy against the marble floor, cameras flashing wildly outside the courthouse windows. The door shut behind him, and silence settled back into the room. Martin appeared by my side, holding out a cigar wrapped neatly in cellophane. "For old time's sake," he said, a grin spreading across his face. I accepted it, turning it over in my hands. "Old times," I agreed, slipping it into my pocket. As we stepped outside, the chill of the air bit against my cheeks, but it didn't feel cold. It felt crisp, fresh. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, the screen flashing with Lawrence Devlin's name. I answered, bringing it to my ear. "Westbrook just signed the deal," Lawrence said, his voice brimming with satisfaction. "You're the new architect of the largest property management system in the state." I looked back at the courthouse, the last of the reporters drifting away, the shadows stretching long across the steps. "I'll be there first thing tomorrow," I replied. "Welcome to the big leagues," Lawrence said, and the line went dead. Veltria was gone, but its ashes built something far greater. The towering glass walls of Devlin Systems HQ glimmered in the early morning light, catching reflections of the mountains beyond. I stood by the expansive windows of the new data center, watching the servers hum quietly behind layers of transparent glass. Rows upon rows of blinking lights stretched out like veins, pulsing with life and precision. Lawrence stepped up beside me, holding a rolled-up set of blueprints. He unfurled them on the stainless steel table that stretched across the room. "We're going to do it right this time," he said firmly, his eyes scanning the detailed plans. I nodded, my gaze drifting over the mapped-out architecture. Every wire, every server, every backup system was detailed meticulously, a testament to how things should have been done from the start. "Westbrook's data is flowing in smoothly," Martin called out from his workstation, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He had set up his own corner of the data center, piles of documentation stacked neatly, labeled with military precision. His screens glowed with synchronized graphs, status bars lighting up in clean shades of green. "No errors, no delays," he added, turning to flash me a grin. We moved through the corridors of the new center, glass panels sliding open with a soft hiss as we approached. Hank Milton met us at the main server cluster, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and focused. "Final diagnostics are clean," he reported, handing me a printed log. "Not a single corrupted file during migration. That's a first." I flipped through the log, nodding with satisfaction. Everything was accounted for, every entry time-stamped and cross-checked. "That's what happens when you document everything," I said, handing the papers back. Martin chuckled from his desk, overhearing. "Documentation," he mused. "Who would have thought?" Hank led us to the central control panel, a sleek interface that spanned the length of the room. He tapped a few buttons, bringing up real-time data streams that flickered across the screen. Tenant records, maintenance logs, financial transactions, all running seamlessly through Devlin's new architecture. "No more patching over patching," Hank muttered, shaking his head. "It's beautiful." I couldn't help but smile. "It is," I agreed, patting him on the back. "And it's only the beginning." That afternoon, Lawrence gathered the team in the main conference hall. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting the light from dozens of monitors displaying live metrics and synchronized server logs. Investors and partners filled the seats, murmurs of anticipation echoing through the space. Lawrence stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. "Today marks a new era for property management," he began, his voice steady and clear. "We've taken what was broken, what was neglected, and rebuilt it stronger, smarter, more resilient." His eyes scanned the room, landing on me. And it wouldn't have been possible without the man who built the foundation of it all, Walter Keaton. A wave of applause swept through the room as I stood, nodding respectfully. I made my way to the podium, shaking Lawrence's hand firmly before stepping up to the mic. The crowd settled, eyes fixed on me. 20 years ago, I began, my voice steady but laced with the weight of history. We built something from nothing. Veltria was a testament to what good infrastructure and smart design could achieve. But somewhere along the way, it lost its way. We lost our way. I paused, scanning the room. Martin gave me a nod of encouragement from the side, Hank leaning back with a satisfied grin. "Today," I continued, "we rebuild. Not just the systems, but the trust, the reliability, the strength that this industry deserves. This is what happens when you build it right." The applause came strong and genuine, echoing off the glass walls and reverberating through the hall. For the first time in years, I felt something settle deep within me, a peace that had been long absent. After the presentation, Lawrence found me near the server room, where I was watching the status bars flash with synchronized precision. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did good up there," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "You did real good." I looked back at the humming rows of servers, my gaze falling on the glass-encased ID card mounted on the wall. It was the same Veltria badge I had placed on my desk the day I walked out, now restored and framed. A symbol of survival, of reinvention. Lawrence reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a thick envelope. "Before you head out," he said, handing it to me. "Open it." I took the envelope, feeling its weight. Sliding my finger under the seal, I pulled out a neatly folded letterhead. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "The Keaton Foundation Scholarship, Building the Future of Technology." I looked up at him, eyebrows raised. He just smiled. "We're opening a scholarship fund under your name," he explained, "and you're leading it." For a moment I couldn't speak. I stared back down at the letter, my mind processing the words. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lawrence chuckled. "Dead serious," he replied. "You've built systems that have lasted decades. I want you to build minds that last even longer." The room seemed to still, the hum of the servers softening into the background. I looked back at the glass-encased ID card on the wall, my reflection merging with it. "Then let's get to work," I said finally, slipping the letter back into the envelope. Lawrence's smile broadened. "That's the spirit," he said, clapping me on the back. "That's the spirit." From ruins, we rebuilt, and this time, we would do it right. The Boulder Convention Center buzzed with energy, its grand hall filled with rows of eager faces, students, engineers, and industry leaders, all gathered beneath towering chandeliers and sweeping archways. The banners along the walls proudly displayed the name, the Keaton Foundation. Building for Tomorrow. I stood at the back of the hall for a moment, letting the scene settle in. Samantha walked up beside me, straightening her blazer, eyes scanning the crowd. "It's a full house," she noted, a hint of pride in her voice. I nodded, feeling the weight of it all, everything that had led to this moment. "They're here because of you," she added, nudging my arm. I shook my head. "They're here because we built something that matters," I replied. She smiled, the kind of smile that knew the price of victory. "The best part of building," she whispered, "is watching it grow." The ceremony began promptly at 10, the lights dimming as the stage illuminated with the Devlin Systems logo, spinning slowly against a deep blue backdrop. Lawrence took the podium first, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "Today," he began, "we celebrate not just technology, but the spirit of building something that lasts, something resilient. And none of this would be possible without the man who reminded us that integrity is the foundation of every good system, Walter Keaton." The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that washed over the room. I stepped up to the stage, shaking Lawrence's hand firmly before turning to the audience. Hundreds of eyes watched me. Young students fresh with ambition, seasoned engineers who had seen the rise and fall of empires. I adjusted the microphone, clearing my throat. "I remember the first time I walked into Veltria's office," I began, my voice steady. "There were 2 computers, a dial-up modem, and a whole lot of ambition. We built it piece by piece, not because we had to, but because we wanted it to last. And for a while, it did." I paused, scanning the faces, letting the silence settle. But then we stopped building. We started patching. We started cutting corners, taking shortcuts. And in the end, it all fell apart. The room grew still, the kind of stillness that listens. "Today," I continued, raising my hand to the banners along the walls, "we start over. We rebuild, not just with code, but with purpose, with integrity. Because when you build something right, it lasts. It outlives you." The applause grew again, rolling through the hall like thunder. I stepped back, allowing Samantha to take the podium. She walked with the confidence I had always admired, her presence commanding yet graceful. "The Keaton Foundation," she announced, "is not just a scholarship. It's a commitment to teach the next generation of engineers how to build with integrity, how to design with purpose, and most importantly, how to leave things better than they found them. The lights dimmed, and the screens behind us flickered to life, displaying the names of the first scholarship recipients. Young faces filled the stage, shaking hands, accepting their certificates with wide eyes and proud smiles. I stood to the side, watching as each of them passed by, some nodding in appreciation, others too overwhelmed to speak. When the last student accepted their award, I stepped forward once more. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small glass-encased ID card. It shimmered under the stage lights, the old Veltria logo barely visible beneath the surface. The crowd hushed as I walked toward a young student standing nervously at the edge of the stage. His eyes were wide, hands trembling slightly as I approached. I extended the ID card toward him, his eyes flickering with surprise. "This is where I started," I said quietly, pressing it into his hands. "I built something that mattered. Now it's your turn. Build it better." He took the card, his hands steadying as he looked up at me with determination. "I will," he replied, voice firm. I patted his shoulder, watching as he held the card to his chest, a symbol of where things began and where they would go. The lights dimmed once more, and the Devlin Systems logo flashed boldly on the screens, spinning slowly, reflecting off the polished floors. The crowd rose to their feet, applause filling the hall, echoing off the marble walls and glass panes. I looked over at Lawrence, who was grinning broadly. "Not bad for a first class," he said, clapping me on the back. "Not bad at all," I replied, my eyes drifting back to the students, their faces glowing with ambition and hope. Samantha joined us, arms crossed, her expression softening as she watched the crowd disperse. "You did good, Dad," she said, her voice gentle. I turned to her, feeling the weight of everything, the struggle, the losses, the rebuild, and nodded. "We did good," I corrected. Lawrence stepped forward, handing me a folder embossed with the Devlin insignia. "There's one more thing," he said, his eyes shining with that familiar spark. I raised an eyebrow, cracking the seal and flipping it open. Inside was the outline for a new project, something larger, something ambitious. At the bottom of the page, a single line read, "Future starts now." I looked up at Lawrence, then back at Samantha. "Ready to build it right this time?" I asked. Lawrence laughed, deep and genuine. "With you leading it?" "I wouldn't have it any other way." I folded the folder shut, slipping it under my arm. "Let's get to work," I replied, and we walked out of the convention hall, ready to begin again. This time, with purpose. The sunlight poured through the glass walls of Devlin Systems' new data center, reflecting off the small, encased ID card that hung proudly near the entrance. It had been polished, its edges smooth, and its surface gleamed with a kind of redemption that felt earned. Sometimes I'd catch young engineers pausing to look at it, fingers brushing its surface as if searching for the stories etched in its cracks. We rebuilt from ruins, not just systems, but trust, integrity, and purpose. I learned that when something breaks, it isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's just a chance to rebuild it stronger. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. As I watched the next generation file into the hall, fresh-faced and eager, I couldn't help but wonder, has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? If it has, maybe it's time to start building it, right?